Sorry about the sound. I'm about to head out, but I don't want. There's an audio event that I don't know when they're going to stop.
Right, I can hear you.
Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture. It's so nice to see a full room today, which is basically the last day of the semester, basically the whole academic year. So we are very pleased to see you here, and welcome to this public lecture that is titled "It's Time to Talk About World War III: Facing the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy Starts with Learning Lost Lessons of the Past." My name is Giuseppe Paparella, and I am the inaugural Security and Foreign Policy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Global Research Institute at William & Mary. And as my research is concerned with US foreign policy and its historical development, I was particularly struck by a powerful editorial that I read in the New York Times back in December about the risk of World War III and the critical role that historical memory can play in preventing that outcome. And so I had imagined that it would be fantastic to have an author of that editorial, based in William & Mary, to talk about this very topic and these important and yet overlooked themes. And so I'm very delighted that today is the day. Thank you, Dr. Wertheim, for coming here to share your insight and to deliver this lecture. This lecture has been jointly organized by the Security and Foreign Policy Initiative at the Global Research Institute and by the History Department. So I would like to thank Professor Trisco Darden, the director of the Security and Foreign Policy Initiative, and the donors and funders that made this lecture possible. In addition, I would like also to thank Cassie Key from the Global Research Institute that was absolutely instrumental in the organization of this. We now give the floor to Professor Duška Beneš, the chair of the History Department. Thank you very much and enjoy this lecture.
It's my great honor to introduce Dr. Stephen Wertheim, who is the Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He received his PhD from Columbia University in 2015 and his A.B. summa cum laude from Harvard University in 2007. Dr. Wertheim is an historian of U.S. foreign policy and an analyst of contemporary problems in American grand strategy. During the 2022-23 academic year, he is a distinguished lecturer in history at Catholic University and a visiting lecturer in law at Yale Law School. Dr. Wertheim is the author of Tomorrow the World, the Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, published by Harvard University Press in 2020. This book reveals how U.S. leaders decided in the lead up to the attack on Pearl Harbor to pursue global military dominance as an effectively perpetual project. He has published scholarly research on a range of subjects in U.S. foreign policy since the late 19th century, including humanitarian intervention, international law, international organization, colonial empire, and global public opinion. Dr. Wertheim regularly comments on current events and was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers for the COVID-19 age by Prospect magazine. His essays have appeared in all of my favorite publications: The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. His TV and radio appearances include C-SPAN, Deutsche Welle, MSNBC, NPR, and PBS. Before coming to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Dr. Wertheim was Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank he co-founded in 2019. He also held faculty positions in history at Columbia University and Birkbeck at the University of London, and postdoctoral research fellowships at Princeton University and King's College at the University of Cambridge. He's going to speak today for approximately 35 minutes, and we'll have 25 minutes after the talk for discussion and for questions. The title of his talk, once again, is It's Time to Talk About World War III. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wertheim.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I want to thank the Global Research Institute and the Department of History for bringing me here and putting this on. A special thanks to Cassie for making the arrangements. Where are you? There you go.
Hello.
Thank you for making the arrangements so deftly. And I'm just looking forward to sending you off into a beautiful summer by discussing the prospect of World War III. I guess I figure I didn't have fun in college, so why should you? But I'm not the only one who is talking about World War III. Last March, in the opening weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, President Biden did so. He faced pressure to get more deeply involved in the war. And on one day in particular, he invoked the specter of a third world war 4 times in a single day. He said, quote, "The idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews, just understand and don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say." I think he was talking to the press. That's called World War III. Now, to my mind, Biden's warning signaled the start of a new era in American foreign policy. It is one in which the United States faces the real and regular prospect of fighting a major power war, not only against Russia, but potentially against China. This grim reality has arrived first gradually and then suddenly. Throughout my adult lifetime and that most Americans alive today, the United States has bestrode the world, unchallenged, virtually unchecked, except by adversaries that had to use their own weakness in order to harm the United States. It was the unipolar moment, a phrase coined by the commentator Charles Wertheim in 1990, as the United States geared up to lead a coalition to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait in the Persian Gulf War. And after the collapse of America's Cold War rival, the Soviet Union, the United States set out to maintain and even expand its global military presence and defense commitments. It didn't do this because it perceived a major threat to its vital interests, although many threats have been invoked along the way. But I think it's more accurate to say that the United States maintained military dominance in the post-Cold War era because it perceived a lack of major threats, and thus minimal costs and risks to preserving American preeminence by preventing challengers from arising. So you might ask the question, why? But Washington preferred the question, why not? In 1992, the Pentagon, under the first President Bush, as well as then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and his deputy Paul Wolfowitz, laid out a theory of the case in a document called the Defense Planning Guidance, and they explicitly aimed to dissuade any potential rival from even aspiring, in their words, to challenge U.S. military preeminence, basically anywhere. They had a list of strategically important regions that included Europe, East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and of course the Western Hemisphere. This strategy was not about making defense commitments to countries that the United States feared might actually be attacked in any foreseeable timeline. It was about what some of them would term dissuasion, building up such a superior position globally and in important regions that no country would waste money building up their military to challenge the United States. And this logic of dissuasion, or it's a preventive logic, not just deterrence, that goes beyond deterrence. It drove US policy to a large extent under Democrats and Republicans. So when members of Congress approved the enlargement of NATO to new members in the 1990s and the 2000s, they were not taking very seriously the prospect that those members would have to be defended in the near term or the medium term. In fact, the most scrutiny about the defensibility or the reasons to defend new members came earlier in 1997 in the first round of enlargement. And after that first round, which extended NATO membership just to 3 countries, after that first round, fewer and fewer concerns were raised on this score, such that the Senate was unanimous in approving the next round of NATO enlargement in 2003 to many more countries, including the Baltic states, small states that were incorporated as part of the Soviet Union, not just the Warsaw Pact, and are difficult to defend. So for Washington, the hope was to preserve U.S. dominance as far as possible into the future, to obtain peace through strength, not war with major rivals who weren't really supposed to arise at all. Even just a few years ago, it was still about possible to expect a benign geopolitical future. It's true that great power competition became a watchword in Washington during the Trump administration, but that phrase could imply almost sporting rivalry as well as much as explosive conflict. Beijing, Moscow, Washington would stiffly compete, but surely they could coexist. Well, I think that's no longer where we are. The war in Ukraine has created an acute risk of US-Russia conflict, and it will continue to do so as long as it goes on. The war has also vaulted a Chinese invasion of Taiwan to the forefront of American fears, particularly in the mind of Congress. A high-intensity conflict with either rival surely would merit Biden's description of World War III. Yet, I wonder how many Americans today can truly envision what a third world war would mean. Most Americans are unused to enduring any hardship or foreign policy choices, let alone the loss of life and wealth that direct war in China or Russia would bring. And just as great power conflict looms, those who witnessed the last one are passing from the scene. Around 1% of US veterans who served in World War II remain alive to tell their stories. By the end of this decade, they're estimated to number fewer than 10,000. Effectively, they will be absent from public life if they are not already. To me, preparing the country for this challenge, it may take more tanks, planes, and ships, but there's something more profound that's needed. It will require a national effort of historical recovery and imagination. And the primary goal of that effort should be to enable policymakers, legislators, and the public to consider how to prevent a conflict and whether they wish to enter a major war if the moment of decision arrives. So to that end, I'm going to spend some time talking about historical memory, how the memory of World War II exerted something of a sobering influence in the United States in the decade that followed, which is unusually heavy things, alongside the more familiar lesson of the triumphant victory over fascism. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges we face today and going forward. So even as the experience of 2 world wars propelled the United States to world leadership, American leaders and citizens feared that a third world war might be probable. This is perhaps an important reason why a catastrophe was avoided. I mean, it's easy to look back at US-Soviet rivalry as a time of stable and predictable relations. This is part of how things looked to protagonists at the time. Dwight Eisenhower told a group of World War II veterans in 1952, "I'm running for president for just one reason, that is to ensure that nothing like that war will ever occur again." Regardless of party, the post-war presidents who steered the Cold War from confrontation to détente appreciated that the next hot war would likely be worse than the last. This time, nuclear weapons could lay waste to the mainland United States, which had been spared from the violence of World War I and World War II. I want to quote President Harry Truman's remarks on October 7th, 1945. This is just a month after victory over Japan. He said, now in 1938, he's at a county fair. In 1938, I stood on this platform right here and explained to you that our then isolationism would eventually lead to war. But we can't stand another global war. We can't ever have another war unless it is a total war. And that means the end of our civilization as we know it. We are not going to do that. Now, this insight didn't keep Truman or his successors from meddling in third world countries, from Guatemala to Indonesia. It's a very long list. It didn't keep them from including alliances in Europe and Northeast Asia. But leading Americans recognized that if the United States and the Soviet Union squared off directly, Americans would suffer grievously. As the columnist Walter Lippmann used in 1948, quote, we must ask ourselves whether we have become entangled in a degenerating cycle of wars that breed more wars, each more savage and more inconclusive than the last. For ordinary Americans, nuclear terror became a part of everyday life. That was thanks to a purposeful effort by the U.S. government to prepare the country for the worst. The Federal Civil Defense Administration advised citizens to build bomb shelters in their backyard. They advised them to keep their homes clean of clutter so that a nuclear blast wouldn't have as much stuff to burn. Apparently not bad advice.
Good luck today.
Might be wise. The film Duck and Cover, released in 1951, encouraged school children to act like the animated turtles and hide under a makeshift shell in the event of a nuclear explosion. The film shows picnickers diving under a blanket, and the narrator coolly instructs the visitor, the viewer rather, no matter where we live, in the city or the country, we must be ready all the time for the atomic bomb. By the 1960s, yellow and black signs for fallout shelters dotted American cities. So as the Cold War threatened to become thermonuclear, that specter disciplined each side to avoid a direct US-Soviet clash. During the Korean War, the Chinese troops entered the conflict, pushed US and South Korean forces back to the 38th parallel. General Douglas MacArthur pleaded with President Truman to escalate the war by unleashing 34 nuclear bombs on China and North Korea. MacArthur was a World War II hero, but Truman refused. He fired the revered general. When he explained himself to the nation, he evoked what he called the disaster of World War II. How often is World War II described as a disaster today? He declared, quote, we will not take any action which might place upon us the responsibility of initiating the general war, a third world war. The third round would bring mass destruction within American shores. Millions would die quickly. Let's not fool ourselves, Truman said. We can never afford to forget that the terrible destruction of cities and of civilization as we know it is a real possibility. The American public did sour on the war effort in Korea and came around to accept a divided entity. And today, Truman is remembered for the Truman Doctrine, his pledge of support to free peoples everywhere resisting communist pressure. Not much remember his statement that, and I quote, what our foreign policy is all about is to prevent atomic war from coming. Similarly, the Cuban Missile Crisis, extreme violence of the world wars, and fear of another, shaped the decision-making of John F. Kennedy during the crisis when the Soviet Union moved to place nuclear armed weapons 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Kennedy grew frustrated with his advisors for recommending preventative strikes on Soviet missile sites. He told an aide at one point, do you realize that if I make a mistake in this crisis, 200 million people are going to get killed? Instead of opening fire as his first act, Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba and demanded that the Soviets withdraw their missiles. Now, for 1 week, a superpower standoff ensued. Approximately 10 million Americans fled their homes. It may be used from movies to the high-level decision-making in the White House, but what's happening around the country can be forgotten. Crowds descended on civil defense offices to find out how to survive a nuclear blast. Not everyone was satisfied with the answer they got. The Philadelphia Tribune reported at the time that if a 20 megaton bomb fell on City Hall tomorrow, 250,000 people would swiftly perish. Thankfully, the Soviets backed down after Kennedy secretly promised to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but the world had come so close to nuclear Armageddon that Kennedy took the first steps toward détente before his death in 1963. In his speech at American University that year in June, he noted, quote, "It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, will be destroyed in the first 24 hours. Well, this seems like an insight that remains true today, but American presidents don't talk like this anymore. And that's in part because historical memory changed. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, World War II was reinterpreted. It was increasingly invoked as a moral triumph, plain and simple. In the 90s in particular, the outpouring of film, history, literature celebrated the greatest generation, in the words of journalist Tom Brokaw, the Americans who won the war. Under their watch, the United States has saved the world and stopped the Holocaust. The Holocaust retrospectively was elevated to the center of the purpose and the meaning of World War II, even though the United States did not enter the war to stop the Holocaust and did not make that its primary objective. Right? So a new generation of Americans, personally untouched by great power conflict, reshaped their past. They revered their elders, but also often simplified experiences that were varied and painful for those who had lived through the conflict. In this context, the double lesson of World War II, calling America to lead the world, but cautioning it not to overreach, narrowed to a single-minded exhortation to sustain and even expand American power, including in the absence of major rivals. Presidents began to invoke World War II exclusively to glorify the struggle and justify the perpetuation of American primacy. On the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, George H.W. Bush told the country, quote, "Isolationism flew escort to the very bombers that attacked our men 50 years ago." So isolationism means pulling back American military positions and alliances. That's something that can never be done again, no matter circumstances. In 1994, commemorating D-Day, its 50th anniversary, Bill Clinton recalled how Allied troops gathered, in words, like the stars of a majestic galaxy and unleashed their democratic fury, fighting a battle that still continues. And then in the next decade, a vast World War II memorial went up between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. The dedication was given by George W. Bush 1 year into invading Iraq. He said then, quote, "The scenes of the concentration camps, the heaps of bodies and ghostly survivors confirmed forever America's calling to oppose ideologies of death." So now preventing a repeat of World War II no longer involved exercising caution. It meant toppling tyrants. Besides, why dwell on the horrors of global conflict at a time when no such thing seemed possible? post-Soviet Russia was reeling, China remained poor. It's true that there were no more great powers for the United States to fight. And it wasn't just major war that seemed passe, so did the need to really pay any significant costs for foreign policy. Since the Vietnam War had roiled American society, leaders moved to insulate the public from the harms of even small conflicts through the all-volunteer force, the use of air power, and today drones. It's true that more than 7,000 service members have died in the post-September 11th war, 4 times as many by suicide. Well, that's, to me, important costs of war. And it's enough to devastate families and communities with service members. But it has not been enough to produce a Vietnam-style backlash. Likewise, although the wars have cost a whopping $8 trillion and counting, the payments have been spread over decades and past. The result is that not having to worry about the effects of wars unless you enlist to fight in them has nearly become a birthright of being an American. One that's no longer the case, for better and for worse. The United States is entering an era of intense strategic rivalry that could escalate to a large-scale conventional or nuclear war. Now, the fact that rivals had indeed emerged to challenge American hegemony, at least near their borders, seemed to discredit the policy of primacy, which was supposed to dissuade a country like China from building and projecting regional and global military power, to prevent a country like Russia from turning aggressively against the West. But the prevalence of balancing against American power should, in my view, make us reevaluate our commitments and focus on those that are really worth defending, since the notion that the United States will overawe competitors through vastly greater power is no longer operative in the world we face, and yet the opposite is happening. The rise of balancing behavior and increasing resistance to American foreign policy priorities is taken as another reason for the United States to invest more in its foreign policy. The United States is trying to maintain, so far, all of its existing security commitments and take on new ones in Finland, which has joined NATO, and Sweden, which would like to join NATO, and the status of Taiwan remains an open question. In a real sense, however, the country, even if it likes to make security commitments, it really doesn't like to retract any. The country and even the policymaking class hasn't really consciously signed up to spend the next generation or more running real risks of great power conflict. So I think it's become a really important task to better understand what these consequences could be, and to imagine how such a conflict might take place, the better to take steps in advance to avoid facing a really wrenching choice. Consider the war in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin controls enough nuclear weapons to destroy life on Earth many times over. It seems to be entirely up to him, pretty much, to decide whether to do that. Since invading Ukraine, he has obviously threatened to use nuclear weapons. Those rhetorical threats need to be taken with a grain of salt. But I think those threats do become credible under several scenarios which are plausible. If U.S. or NATO forces directly enter the conflict, if Putin believes his rule is threatened, or if Ukrainian forces verge on retaking Crimea, possibly if they verge on retaking all the territory Ukraine has lost since the full-scale invasion began on February 24th, since that would hand Putin a complete and undeniable battlefield defeat. Nobody knows. That's the truth. Nobody knows precisely what might prompt the Kremlin to go nuclear. But Biden himself has warned that the risk of Armageddon is the highest it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, a period that he's personally lived through. And as he suggested, escalation can be difficult to control once Russia were to use even a small so-called tactical nuclear weapon, becoming the first state to fire a nuclear weapon in anger since the United States in 1945. It's simply not something we have experienced. Now, I think Biden, to his credit, appreciates the risk of direct conflict with Russia. His administration has, for the most part, avoided committing the United States to ensure a complete Ukrainian victory to reclaim either all the territory that is lost since the beginning of the full-scale invasion or all of its territory under international law, its 1990 borders, which the current government says is its war aim. Yet, the war is far from over. And it's clear that some in Washington will balk at tolerating Russian control of any part of Ukraine. The more Ukraine succeeds in its upcoming counteroffensive, the more some people in Washington will call for pressing further rather than engaging in negotiations meant to find itself. At a certain point, Ukrainian successes, if they occur, will increase the risk of Russian escalation. Conversely, if Ukraine's counteroffensive fails, I think that would weaken Western support for Ukraine, but some will argue that this is also no time to settle because Ukraine needs to make progress on the battlefield first. Well, exactly how much progress is very, very hard to say, except to say we claim all the territory it's lost since February 24th of last year, or perhaps Crimea as well, which again raises serious escalation risk. So, a war becomes endless when at least one side pursues objectives that are ill-defined or unobtainable. I think it's at least debatable whether that description applies to U.S. effort to assist Ukraine today. I can't imagine ways that, particularly if Ukraine's government says it wants to settle, I think that would settle the debate in Washington as well, but it's not clear that Ukraine, or under what circumstances Ukraine would want to make that judgment. And just from a quantitative perspective, the longer the war goes on, the greater the risk of escalation. And I do wonder how widely Americans appreciate these risks. If you recall, the no-fly zone became a kind of media sensation after the Ukrainian government called for one to be opened in the opening weeks of the war, even though the Biden administration had no interest whatsoever in trying to implement a no-fly zone. The media kind of persisted with this idea for several weeks, and according to some opinion polls, more Americans supported a no-fly zone than opposed one, although those numbers in some polls went down when it was explained that a no-fly zone would involve shooting down Russian planes or other military assets. So in addition to this possibility of a war with Russia, U.S. relations with China are in free fall, setting up the two leading powers to square off for seemingly a long time to come. And here, I think, despite Biden's relative caution toward Russia, he's taken some actions that have contributed to the rising chances of conflict with China. 4 times he has, in essence, personally exempted himself from official U.S. policy to declare that the United States has a commitment to defend Taiwan. It does not. It has a commitment to help Taiwan strengthen its defenses. He's also said he would send U.S. troops to defend Taiwan to repel the Chinese invasion. The United States policy is to maintain ambiguity. On that score, he's also said at one point that the issue of Taiwanese independence is up to Taiwan. U.S. policy is that the United States does not support Taiwan independence. In other words, we do have an interest in this question, and it's to not support Taiwanese independence, therefore to deter not only Beijing from coercing Taiwan, but also Taipei from making unilateral steps toward independence that would be stabilizing because they would provoke a negative reaction in the PRC. Now, one problem then is that these kinds of statements, coupled with other actions of Congress, such as increasing visits to Taiwan, may provoke the very attack they are intended to deter, because they risk conveying to Beijing that the United States wishes to see Taiwan permanently separated from the mainland. It's very hard to see a Chinese leader that would accept that kind of position. But more interesting for our purposes today, to me, is that Biden is also implying that defending Taiwan would surely be worth more the price of a war with China. Is that correct, just from the perspective of U.S. interests? Well, to evaluate that proposition, we need to know what such a war would entail. And a series of recent war games suggests a few answers. First, a war would likely last a long time, might be expected to be short, but unlikely to be short, and it would take many lives. Early on, China would have incentives to mount a massive attack to disable U.S. forces stationed in the Western Pacific, especially in Japan and Guam. As the Air Force General Mark Kelly has said, China's forces are, quote, designed to inflict more casualties in the first 30 hours of combat than we've endured over the last 30 years in the Middle East. In most rounds of one recent war game, the United States quickly lost 2 aircraft carriers. Each of them carries at least 5,000 people on top of hundreds of aircraft. Second, each side would be tempted to escalate to bring such a costly conflict to a close on its terms. In another war game held last summer, China demonstrated its resolve by detonating a nuclear weapon near Hawaii. The game ended at that point, which is maybe not particularly helpful. But one wonders what the response would be. Other war games also involved nuclear weapons use. The conveners concluded before they knew it, both the United States and China had crossed key red lines, but neither was willing to back down. This is not an atypical outcome of war games and wars. China, over the course of the war, could mount attacks to disrupt critical infrastructure in the United States homeland. It might shut off the power in a major city, obstruct emergency services, bring down communication systems. One wonders the effect on America at home. Could it be something that brings the country together? Possibly. Or could it be something that sweeps a new current of fear and suspicion through American society, joining up with the nativism that has reverberated through national politics since September 11th? I think it's true that the United States could inflict more damage on China than China could inflict on the United States. But the real question is whether Americans would come out better for this effort relative to a world in which we may do even if the United States did not go to war with China over Taiwan, which is something we can talk about what that world looks like, but is a world where at least the United States would be in better shape in the short term. The question being, what does that do to the region and U.S. interests over the longer term? And once the Chinese leadership staked its credibility on conquering Taiwan, it would likely be willing to read the suffering in order to avoid defeat. Taiwan would matter more to Beijing than it would matter to Washington. So there may be an imbalance of sheer power, but there's also an imbalance of interest and resolve. We see a similar situation in the war in Ukraine, where Ukraine matters more to Russia than it does to the United States. Prove that is that the United States is not going to war with Russia. Then, of course, there would be economic consequences. This has not been well studied. to my knowledge, but there is a rather crude estimate that came out of a RAND study that supposed that a year-long conflict would slash America's gross domestic product by 5 to 10%. I think it's a low estimate, but they're just kind of looking at a shutoff of U.S.-China trade. There would also be implications for trade with third countries, the question of economic sanctions. To put that in perspective, the U.S. economy contracted by 2.6% in 2009, which was the worst year, the worst 12-month period on a calendar year of the Great Recession. 3/5 of Americans today live paycheck to paycheck, and they would be damaged in their lives on a scale without precedent in the living memory of most citizens. So how would they react? How would the American political system actually function in a conflict like this? I think that there is profound uncertainty on that score. It's not just a question of risk. If risk is something that could be quantified, it's a matter of uncertainty. I don't know how we're supposed to know, except to get into that situation. Getting into a war probably be easy enough. Though a recent survey showed that 40% of Americans favor sending U.S. troops to Taiwan should China invade. But more elusive is whether the public and its representatives would maintain the will to fight over far from home territories in the face of sustained physical attack and economic calamity. What happens if millions are thrown out of work? What do they make then of the value of Taiwan's cause? Could national leaders compellingly explain why the United States is paying this price? If these questions would be asked during conflict, they ought to be asked in advance of one. It seems to me that even those who think the United States should make a bigger commitment to defend Taiwan, or should push for maximal war aid to Ukraine, have an interest in educating the public about the stakes of major power conflict in the nuclear and cyber age. It might be time to make a remake of Duck and Cover, maybe something more memorable than the Department of Homeland Security, its nuclear explosion fact sheet. It's a nice document, probably made on Microsoft Word. It does contain some sound advice, and only for the purposes of preparing the op-ed of this talk did I ever think to look at it. It actually has some useful information. Turns out that after the shockwave passes, you have 10 minutes or more to find shelter before the radioactive fallout arrives. Pretty good. 10 minutes. But more important than that is, I think, a difference in the way that media considers foreign policy questions, that experts present foreign policy questions. For every moral condemnation of adversaries' actions, Americans should also hear candid assessments of the costs of alternative courses of action, trying to undo those problems. So if we don't raise public awareness in that way, if we keep treating security commitments as almost cost-free things to hand out, we risk bringing about the worst case outcome of waging World War III and losing it when it turns out that the country recoils from paying the price. So let me just conclude. I very much look forward to your questions. As international relations have deteriorated in recent years, critics of American foreign policy have frequently warned that a new Cold War was brewing. In fact, I think this has been a warning that's endured throughout the post-Cold War period, including in the 1990s. I'm guilty of that. I asked you 2019, is it too late to stop a Cold War with China? And yet, I'm not so sure I got it right. Pointing to a Cold War in some ways understates the danger. Relations with Russia and China are not assured to stay cold. during the original Cold War, American leaders and citizens knew that survival was not inevitable. A major conflict remained an all too possible destination of that conflict right up to its astonishing end in 1989, which nobody thought was inevitable before it happened, and now is assumed to be inevitable. You know, if U.S.-China competition or U.S.-Russia competition is a Cold War, we think we know how that ends. Today, the United States is again assuming the primary burden of countering the ambitions of government's invasion in Moscow. When it did so the first time, at least it lived in the shadow of World War and acted out of a frank and healthy fear of another one. This time, I think our task is more difficult, is to learn the lessons intellectually so we don't have to learn them through experience again. So I will just leave it there and very much welcome your questions.
Okay, let's take a few questions or
Let's take
two. Okay. Thank you, Stephen. That was a fantastic, great lecture. Very enlightening, and I'm sure will trigger a lot of questions and, of course, engagement with this important topic. Okay, so let's begin. Who has questions? Good. Okay, one. Okay.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you are in agreement with a lot of things I've heard historian Neil Ferguson talk about. And what he asserts is that, you know, rather than endure the cost of the war, what we should be doing right now is to investing in deterrence the way we did in the first Cold War. I was wondering what you thought of that.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's any applicable lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic where the American public was asked to make sacrifices, wear masks, that don't go to bars, that a lot of people just chose not to do. They chose not to take up that cost, whether because they just didn't think it was an issue or they didn't believe that it was worth their efforts. So do you see, I guess that's unwillingness for a lot of Americans to go through that suffering. Would that apply to this situation with war? And are there any lessons and changes we can make with the context of war?
And then next.
I'll give my question.
Okay.
Between China and the United States, we have a different cycle. Strategic cycle is more 4 to 10 years, whereas China seems to be 100 to 500 year plan. So sometimes it gives them a little bit more patience to be able to say, this is okay, it's just a little anthill, whereas it becomes our news cycle and some politician has got to react really quick. So I'm wondering if, you know, you have, if we were going to go to war, of course, they're going to have to be bands and flags waving and patriotic songs to get the public to accept it. But I agree with your premise that we don't know what we're accepting. We think it's going to be sweet until it turns out to not be. And of course, then there's also cyber war versus always nuclear war. But you're sort of suggesting that nuclear war is what's going to happen if it's superpower to superpower. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so 3 excellent questions. Let me take the first one on deterrence. You can't separate the question of deterrence and defense, because deterrence is not guaranteed to succeed. And so if it doesn't succeed, the United States makes a defense commitment, builds up its forces, levels it thinks are adequate, and conflict occurs. What then? That's the kind of question that I'm posing. But I'll go a step further on Taiwan, because I think that for a number of commentators, especially in the sort of Congress media sphere, they view this as a deterrence problem. The problem is that China's military power has grown. Taiwan spends very little on its defense. And they assume that China would really like to swallow up Taiwan. And so if it thinks it can get away with it, it will. I think that misses something really central to this problem in particular, not absent from other situations, but especially important in the Taiwan-China context, which is that a conflict can arise because from Beijing's perspective, it has a red line. It has maintained over a long period of time that Taiwan cannot be permanently separated from mainland China. The United States, in order to open up diplomatic relations with China, had to abrogate its defense commitment to Taiwan. It had to forge the one China policy, these 3 joint U.S. PRC communiques. It was not always smooth, right? It remains rocky, but the essence of this approach was to allow the countries to live and let live. The United States acknowledged and said it would not contest the Chinese view that there was one China, Taiwan was part of China. It didn't say it endorsed that view, but it would allow that as a possible truth. So if the United States takes actions that suggest that it views Taiwan as permanently part of its security network, such as by saying it will defend Taiwan in a clear way, in an ambiguous way, but potentially not only that, right? Then what I fear is that China may invade Taiwan, even if it thinks it might lose, or probably lose, and even if it thinks the economic consequences will be terrible, because this is a issue of sovereignty and self-image for China, and would severely affect the credibility of a Chinese leader that allowed Taiwan to be seen to be permanently separated from mainland China. So I think we have to think about what political scientists call the spiral model of conflict, in addition to the deterrence model. Both of those are important elements in this case. With respect to the question of time horizons, I wouldn't say that China has a 100-year plan for anything. The current government of China dates to at most 1949, so we're already within 100 years. And there have been so many profound changes in the political institutions of China and its foreign relations. So our current situation isn't forever, and it may well change. China has to face a lot of difficult circumstances that I don't think its leaders have a crystal ball about. But I think maybe the more profound issue here than sort of China maybe can plan as a one-party state, whereas the United States is erratic, is that the kinds of things that would spark a conflict between the United States and China are of relatively low importance to the inherent interests of the United States relative to those of China. So we are very close to China. We're talking about the South China Sea, we're talking about Taiwan. And that would give, I think, a high level of results. You think about who can out-escalate the other. Well, leaders in Beijing may well think that they can out-escalate leaders in Washington. That's probably why in that war game, they decided to detonate a nuclear weapon in Hawaii as a warning. And I'm not sure that they are wrong to make that judgment. At what point does Washington back down and say, this can't possibly be working for us? So that's, I think, really important. And I love the question about the COVID pandemic. One could sort of argue that, you can see this either way. So maybe part of the reason why COVID drove Americans apart, heightened distrust, is that something about being in war with another set of people right? Having people as an adversary that just didn't provide the same amount of unifying effect as a virus. Moreover, a virus that was affecting the entire world. On the other hand, I think it's clearly very tempting for a lot of policymakers when they think about great power competition, the U.S.-China relationship, to draw upon the Cold War as their reference point for how these kinds of things play out. They really have no other reference point. Then they can imagine, as several current Biden administration officials have written just before coming into office, that making an enemy out of China could be the thing that brings Americans together, gets Republicans and Democrats to agree. That's what it is. At least if you look at congressional votes, right? This is one of the few things that commands serious bipartisan support. Now, the Republican side unites the Trump MAGA wing with the more traditional Republican party. So for now, it seems like getting tough on China is something that inspires a degree of political unity. The question is, how deep is that unity? When you scratch the surface, do you make this not about standing up to China, looking tough, taking actions that haven't brought about costly consequences so far, and we actually get to something that's very different. So this is where I just say, I don't have an answer to your question, but I think it's very important because, personally, if I think about how would the social cohesion of the United States fare in a situation of prolonged, intense warfare, I think the last 3 decades might be more telling as a guide than the middle of the 20th century. We were a very different country. At least we are more similar to the country of the last, 2-3 decades than we are to that country in the past. So I think this is an interesting area for
So we go. Thank you. And that's you next. And then
So it seems that the rhetoric and everything around the issues is looking more and more likely that great conflict would happen. At the same time, it also seems like the preparation is sort of lackluster. Branches missing their recruitment numbers. As the budget grows year after year, we're still seeing specifically like Navy ship yards backlogging, years behind, programs wasted. And with that, also the maritime logistics force being very underwhelming. So I wanted to know your thoughts, like with the war games that have been going on the past few years that are calling for a certain amount of combatants, submarines, new weaponry on ships, and then the call for the logistics to provide all that in a theater that is so far away.
Perfect. So I am chiming in with a question from our online audience. So Will Ruger, William Mary Lung would like to know, is there an alternative approach to grand strategy more broadly in China and Russia in particular that could meet America's vital national interests? So no follow-ups for me, please.
okay. Okay, next.
Would you say that the memories of World War II are more alive in Russia and China than here because they comparatively suffered a lot more? And does that affect how their policymakers have been acting?
All right. 3 fantastic questions. I know we're running a little bit over time, so if anyone has to leave, feel free. Let me focus on the last 2 questions because I don't have a magical answer to those challenges. Although I do think having a clearer set of strategic priorities would really help us focus our budgets, focus our procurement, and not face the risks of overstretch that we seem to be facing. In addition to which, I think defense budgets, even though they're rising, are going to have to higher to maintain the current grant strategy we have, and that gets to William and Mary Ruger's very enticing question. Yes, there is an alternative approach. That approach has been called restraint, and this is an approach that came out of the 1990s when scholars realized that the United States had essentially turned global dominance into a perpetual project, since it seemed to be the right answer for Washington, whether there were major competitors or not. And they suggested that the United States could take a much lower military profile, by down most of its Cold War alliances, and would have ample time if important regions like Europe, the Middle East, East Asia were unable to find a workable balance of power themselves. The United States would shift its forces offshore, and then maybe there wouldn't be a problem that would merit the United States coming onshore. Or if an actual great power that had the capability of overrunning Eurasia did actually arise, then the United States would have time to balance against that competitor, as it had done in World War II and the Cold War. And I think what's so interesting about the choices that the United States made is that sort of in the name of upholding the 1945 global order, in fact, if you read the defense planning guidance of 1992, it says explicitly, we reacted way too late in World War II and the Cold War. That was so risky. The world was on the brink of disaster. We can never even allow getting into that kind of position again. Hence, maintaining and expanding American alliances and military presence in perpetuity. So it's a quite radical position. And I think what restraint, which is really well articulated by Barry Posen, a scholar from MIT, and called restraint, published about a decade ago, really forces us to think about is exactly what is strategically essential to the United States. There's pretty wide agreement that it would be preventing a Eurasian hegemon, perhaps liberal Eurasian hegemon, but it's quite plausible that the best way to do that, the most cost-effective way, but also the way that strategically the most sound, is to be offshore for quite a long period of time, because it's in fact very unlikely that a single power would be able to dominate Europe or dominate Asia. Now today, circumstances aren't quite as propitious for a restrainer like Barry Posen, because China has now risen to the level of power it has. So you see a lot of people now take the view, or I should say there's a kind of active debate as to whether the United States should focus on being onshore in Asia, but offshore in Europe and the greater Middle East, or whether it could still profitably pull back in the across-the-board way that Posen says. So I definitely invite you to look at that debate about roughly primacy and restraint. What I talked about in the talk was how, for decades in the post-Cold War period, primacists were the ones saying American power isn't generating balance. It's not generating resistance in the world. Therefore, the costs are low. Why don't we keep a good thing going? So it has all these other purported benefits. We're suppressing security competition and preserving peace. And the restrainers would say, no, right? Balancing is starting to happen, and it's going to happen at some point. And we're in deep trouble when it really starts to happen, because then we spread ourselves so thin, we've made so many commitments to different parts of the world simultaneously. If we can't pull back from some of them, if that's somehow very hard for us to do, then we will be overstretched. That also makes our deterrence less credible. and invites challenges. And I think that the restrained haste has been more borne out by the developments we've seen over the last 3 decades than the case for primacy has been. And the question, what's your question again?
How like memories of World War II in Russia and China have like shaped.
Such a great question. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make too many claims about Russia and China, but it's very clear that Russia in particular, World War II infuses its political culture. It's omnipresent in the way Russia is framing its war in Ukraine. When it calls Ukrainians Nazis, this is very bizarre, especially if the president of Ukraine. But I think what's going on here is that forces that would deny Russia the sphere of influence that it earned by suffering grievously to defeat the Nazis in World War II. Therefore, anyone who sort of is denying that becomes a Nazi. So it's really, really strong in the Russian discourse. I think China's quite different, in part because the PRC came about prior to the Second World War, and it's also kind of the origin story of the current regime. But it is striking at this point how much World War II remains a formative reference point for really all 3 of the most significant powers in the world. And that goes for the United States, which is always trying to get back. I mean, throughout my lifetime, the U.S. foreign policy discourse is always getting back. How do we get back to when we got everything right in 1945? Hence the talk of the post-1945 rules-based order, a relatively new phrase, but what's not new is harkening back to good old days of U.S. world leadership. That's unquestioned, and what I'm trying to convey today is that, well, if you really want to get back to the spirit of 1945, it was, in fact, a much more weary and cautious time than we tend to appreciate.
Final 2 questions. So I've got Alex and one more.
Yeah, I think a lot of newspapers and a lot of politicians talk about how China's rising and the US is declining. And there's a lot of fear mongering that because China's rising, there's like some almost predestined conflict going to happen between the US and China. That's something I've heard a lot. Do you think that's necessarily true? Do you think that just because there's another rising power means there's some inevitable clash going to happen? Or do you think that if we follow what you described as like restraint, maybe backing away a little bit or taking a different approach, we can avoid that conflict?
Any other questions? Any other final thoughts?
Yeah, I think we can go with it.
Good, all right. I mean, I guess this gives me the opportunity, likely opportunity and uplifting note. No, I don't think conflict is inevitable. Certainly not because one power is declining, another power is rising. But if the United States continues to fetishize its dominance, treating its own primacy as tantamount to promotion of U.S. interests, they're not the same thing, then it will be difficult. I think the good news is in the medium term, the issue of Taiwan is really the outstanding issue that would cause U.S.-China conflict. We figured out how to avoid this conflict from a diplomatic perspective, and that's the one China policy. And yet we're chipping away at that one China policy right now. So we need to find ways to make it more credible. I mean, one idea would be to give assurances, credible assurances that the United States under no circumstances would support Taiwan independence. That could strengthen that commitment. But the most important thing is simply to stop eroding it, which is a really wide gap China experts on this score who do see this in terms of spiral dynamic, not just deterrence dynamic, and the deterrence minded. We've just got to, face the Chinese with superior firepower in order to avoid conflict. So, I do think that many experts, they understand China is not Iraq, right? We are deeply connected. And here's the advantage of the Cold War analogy, right? In the Cold War, we did have to take the Soviet Union seriously, its capacity to cause harm seriously. And we did produce Gaetan. So if we're able to get to a place where we appreciate the realities of the situation, we can get to a Gaetan-like relationship, start working out terms of mutual coexistence, which is already present in the Biden administration's rhetoric. It's just, as a goal, it's just cast forward a throwaway line. We can make for a more stable coexistence between the United States and China. There's always going to be competition,